If there's two things in this world that I know a great deal about, it's video games and cemeteries. So today we're going to take a look at 10 different cemeteries and 10 different video games, and give them a rating based on a variety of criteria. Who am I to have any authority on the matter, I hear you ask? I'm just a guy who spent the last 8 years of his life working in a cemetery, doing everything from surveying and measuring grave spaces, digging the grave itself, maintaining the grounds, setting the headstones, and even burying the dead. I've come up with 6 categories in which to rate each cemetery, which consist of ambiance, upkeep, organization, maintainability, location, and adherence to protocol. Ambiance will cover the overall feel and mood of the place in question. Upkeep will determine how well the cemetery is currently maintained. Organization will serve to determine the overall layout of the graves and headstones. Maintainability is a measure of how difficult or easy it would be to manage the upkeep. Location is pretty self-explanatory. Is the cemetery in a good and suitable location? And lastly, adherence to protocol. How closely does this cemetery follow the federal laws and regulations that come with burying the dead? I will give each cemetery a score from 1 to 10 in each of these categories, which will add up at the end to determine which cemetery out of the following 10 is the best. Well, maybe not the best per se, but the most realistic and compliant. Since we're hanging out near the dead, there may be inadvertent spoilers to some of the following games, namely Red Dead Redemption 2 and The Last of Us Part 2. So click away now if you plan on playing any of these. Well, I had to start off with something crazy. It's the place that destroys any naive new player foolish enough to enter. This cliffside cemetery is the Dark Souls of cemeteries, and it's all kinds of janky. There are monuments and headstones sticking out of the hills every which way, like the teeth of an inbred hillbilly. It's cluttered, it's a mess, but there is something strangely appealing about it. You've got some gnarled dead trees that help build the ambiance, and the scenery is quite breathtaking. Plus, they've got some of those 12-foot skeletons that are all the rage for Halloween these days. Jokes aside, everything in this place wants to kill you, so taking a leisurely stroll through the grounds is problematic, and if you're not careful, you might just stumble off the side to your death. So the location they chose leaves quite a bit to be desired. As far as organization goes, I mean, do I need to say anything? Look at this mess. At the very least, I'll give the place a point for having a dedicated pathway throughout. I couldn't even imagine trying to straighten this place up. It's far beyond any help, and if I had to guess, I would say that they did not adhere to any of the local burial laws. Judging by the crowded headstones, it's pretty safe to assume that these plots were not properly surveyed, and there's more than likely just bodies piled on top of bodies underneath the soil, which is lawsuit city if the families catch wind of what's been going on here. In fact, there's a few decaying bodies here and there that the groundskeepers seem to have simply forgotten about. Overall, this cemetery is very nice to look at, from a safe distance, but lacks quite a bit of professionalism. Well, that was not the strongest start in terms of an orderly and well-run cemetery. Let's see if the cemetery in Conker's Bad Fur Day is any better. The first thing I notice immediately, this place is a lot less crowded, but just as dangerous. There are zombie squirrels climbing out of the ground everywhere, and all they want to do is rip a hole in something living. The vibe is dark and mysterious, but also pretty boring. There's just not a lot to the scenery. We've got a nice winding pathway and a few bits of fence here and there to separate the place into sections, as well as a mossy wall that encloses the place. As far as the location goes, it's hard to say where we are really. Conker came in through a cave, and to the far side is a vampire's mansion, so not exactly an easy place to access. The headstones again are facing every which way, but at the very least it's safe to assume that there are not bodies just piled on top of one another. However, most of the monuments are dirty and seem to have been left to nature, so more than likely there's not a whole lot of maintenance going on around here. But yeah, I like the layout of this place. The winding road sort of guides you along to see each grave. If some hedges were planted around some of the markers to create individual estates, this place would bring in a lot of business. But as it is, it's pretty lackluster. Give me a shovel, a string line, and a couple days, and I'd have this place looking right proper. In summation, another very dangerous cemetery to visit, but overall, not in terrible shape. Up next, we're in Resident Evil Village. And this cemetery is by far the most realistic from what we've seen so far. It's a beautiful graveyard set just outside the local church. You can see the monuments are well aligned, well, for the most part, and they paid close attention to making sure that each grave space was placed in a neat and orderly fashion. Although the place is covered in weeds and brush, giving the impression that it's been quite a while since anyone came through and cleaned up the place. There's also a beautiful statue placed out front, as well as another section behind the church that is full of private mausoleums. Very classy stuff here. Of course, there is some danger here, but that all depends on what time of day you decide to visit. I'm here in the evening and there are some demonic-looking goats that do not hesitate to attack you. I suppose that's still a step up from skeletons and zombies. The scenery is quite stunning. The place is covered in fresh snow, and in the distance you can see some beautiful pine forests. For the most part, it seems like they really know how to run a cemetery, and there's not much to complain about, aside from some sloppy grave layouts and the occasional crooked headstone. Up next, we're taking a look at Stardew Valley. Obviously, this is a much more simplistic cemetery, but I will hold it to the same standards. Pelican Town's small, quaint cemetery is located just below the town center, which is not exactly where I would have chosen for it to go. Perhaps somewhere up by Robin's house would have felt more appropriate. There's not a lot to look at here. There's only 4 graves after all, only 2 of which are properly aligned. So normally how it works in a modern cemetery is there are these control points, or pins as we call them. Basically, it's a metal disc on a rod that is hammered into the ground, and typically is stamped with numbers to give the worker a bearing on where they are in the cemetery. When laying out a grave space, you would find at least 3 of these pins in a row and run a string line across them, ensuring you have a straight line. This is used to mark out grave spaces, and also when setting monuments in place. That's just a brief summary, but I hope it helps paint a picture with how it works. I bring this up to illustrate that they obviously did not do this here. In fact, one of the markers is completely crooked. But at least it's safe to assume that each of the deceased are in their very own spot and not cramped up against one another. The place is not very well kept either. The grass is super patchy and the bushes are placed all haphazardly. But it's Stardew Valley after all, so the ambience by itself is pretty relaxing. And for the first time so far, no danger at all. It's a nice place to come and visit for a while, which nobody in town seems to do, except for Abigail on Wednesday nights. Overall, it's a very simple little graveyard with not much to offer. It's a shame to see the state it's in considering how small it is and how easy it would be to fix. I blame Pierre. Red Dead Redemption 2. Now there are actually quite a few cemeteries scattered throughout the lands of Red Dead, and they're all very nice, but I decided to showcase the graveyard in Valentine, since I like it the most and it's most similar to what I know. Much like Resident Evil Village, this cemetery is located right outside the local church, and also much like Resident Evil Village, these markers are neat and well aligned. In fact, not a single one of them seems to be out of alignment, and not a one of them is sinking or in need of repair. The grounds are quiet and peaceful, and it's really just a nice place to spend some time reflecting, or antagonizing grieving widows.
You got a problem, lady?
There's a fence on the far side that's in need of some repair, and the grass could do with some trimming, but I'm really just reaching for something to criticize because everything else here is pretty much perfect. But I think most of us can agree that Rockstar has a great eye for detail, so no surprises here. I will say that some of these larger monuments have a tendency to start sinking in the ground after a few years, sometimes even if they're placed on a concrete foundation. It's not impossible to straighten them up, but it certainly can be a pain. Overall, a very nice cemetery in a great location, and strict adherence to local regulations. So the reason I didn't choose the Saint Denis Cemetery from Red Dead 2 is because the one in Left 4 Dead 2 is shockingly similar in comparison, which makes sense. They're both based on historic cemeteries of New Orleans. Now just objectively, New Orleans is not a great location for a cemetery. The city is mostly below sea level, and we all saw the unfortunate and tragic real-world events of Hurricane Katrina, which is why all these people are entombed in private crypts and mausoleums instead of being buried in the ground. When the flood comes, there is a very real possibility of the caskets and burial vaults floating up out of the ground and being swept away to wherever the water is flowing. All that said, this place is incredibly accurate to a real New Orleans-style cemetery, aside from the hordes of zombies. But at least they aren't really the bite a hole in you kind of zombies, more like death by 1,000 slaps kind of zombies. It is beautiful here. You've got some huge trees providing shade, and if the world hadn't gone to hell, it'd be a nice place to visit and take a walk. Overall, it looks pretty well maintained. Some of the crypts just need a fresh coat of paint and a good cleaning to remove some of that accumulated grime and mildew. However, if by chance any of these crypts or mausoleums started to sink off their foundation, well, you'd need a big old crane to pick that thing up and reset it. Very costly. But yeah, not much else to say here. It's very accurate to real life and the game designers did a great job. We're back to another Rockstar game. It's Grand Theft Auto 5, the game that keeps on giving whether we want it to or not. Now, straight off the bat, this place is classy and accurate to real life, right down to the hose bibs. There's tons of upright markers and private crypts everywhere, all perfectly in line and not a sinking stone to be seen. Mostly pretty clean too. They've clearly got a dedicated team keeping this place up. I would say this is the most similar to the actual cemetery where I spend most of my working hours. They even have a maintenance workshop. I love Rockstar's attention to detail. The entire place is enclosed by a beautiful iron fence, and there's well-maintained pathways throughout the entire park. As far as ambiance goes, there's nothing really special about it. It's as close to reality as possible, so the tone is basically on par with any real-life city park. Though the stunning water feature in the center definitely boosts its tranquility factor. The only thing I can really find to complain about here is some light graffiti on a few of the benches, and the far side of the park has this tiered structure where every row has about a 2-foot drop in front of it. Now, in real life, since this is the modern era and we have machinery to make our lives easier, we typically dig graves using a bobcat with a backhoe attachment. The problem I see with this cemetery structure is the difficulty of getting the backhoe and a dump trailer for the dirt into these tight rows. It's not undoable, but definitely tricky, and you'd have to be really careful not to slip off the drop and roll the machinery over. Otherwise, you would just have to dig the graves the old-fashioned way. Nothing but a shovel and some elbow grease, which actually goes a bit more quickly and easily than you would think. Again, very pleased with the accuracy and the attention to detail. Well done. We're back to something a bit more fantastical. It's the underground insect world of Hollow Knight, and we're taking a stroll through the resting grounds. I've always loved the art style and overall aesthetic of this game, so already the ambiance is top tier for me. As far as upkeep goes, Hallow Nest is a fallen kingdom, so there's little to no maintenance going on down here. That being said, it's pretty clutter-free, and the whole place looks to be in surprisingly decent shape. I love all these monuments in the background. They stand perfectly straight and seem to be all well aligned. But it's hard to gauge considering we're on a 2D plane. I just imagine someone like the nailsmith meticulously carving these stones to pay tribute to the great fallen bug warriors. Some of these monuments are quite massive compared to our little ghost here, so if it was up to him to maintain this place, I'd imagine he'd have a pretty difficult time. But get a husk guard on the job and it should be a piece of cake. As far as location goes, I think this place is pretty much impossible to access unless you're a mighty adventurer in this world. I also took a walk through the Spirit's Glade, where the ghosts of great warriors stand proudly by their graves. It's just really cool, and again these are all well aligned and straight. Nothing really bad to say about this place, but obviously it's far from realistic. We're in Albion now. It's Fable 2, and that means we're visiting Bowerstone Cemetery. This place is huge, with a long winding road throughout the place, and one hell of a giant cemetery mansion at the center of it all, as well as many towering oak trees providing great shade and ambiance. This one is kind of funny because towards the entrance, all the graves are very neat and tidy and in nice straight lines, but the further you venture inward, the more wonky everything seems to get. And you're also tricked into a false sense of security. It's very peaceful by the entrance, but towards the back are swarms of hollow men. Most of the graves look quite ancient, but for some reason the dirt is mounded up like they're all fresh. This is pretty inexcusable. Typically we tamp the ground to prevent future sinking, and then we place sod on the grave within a week after somebody's been buried. The fact that none of them have had this treatment leads me to believe that the management here simply does not give a shit. Also, some of these mausoleums have bare human remains just out in the open. Skulls on display. Anyone can just come by and take them. Very unprofessional, and would most certainly result in a bevy of lawsuits. Location-wise, it's right on the edge of the bustling Bowerstone Market, which I think is a great spot for it. And like I mentioned with Left 4 Dead 2, a sunken mausoleum would be a nightmare to reset upright, and there's plenty of that happening here. In summation, a beautiful park with a lot to offer, but perhaps the groundskeeper should spend less time in the mansion and more time tending to the graves. Last but not least, it's The Last of Us Part 2, the small, humble cemetery in the heart of Jackson. When we see this place in the game, it's wintertime and there's plenty of snow on the ground, which really creates a great atmosphere of depression and grief. Kinda sums this franchise up as a whole, really. The graves are all laid out in a nice little grid, everything is well aligned and each grave has a handmade memorial marker. Much like Rockstar, Naughty Dog is great at packing everything with loads of detail. I love that some of the graves have crosses, and there's a few here and there that have the Star of David. Again, we have a small maintenance workshop. This one is just a shed, but for a small place like this, that's really all you would need. I doubt they would even need an actual mechanical lowering device. They probably just do burials the old-fashioned way, by lowering the casket with ropes. My only gripe is that most of the monuments seem to be made out of wood, which sure, they'll last for a while, but certainly not indefinitely. But hey, it's the post-apocalypse. Easier and less time-consuming to gather and work with wood, rather than stone. They're also clearly running out of space. So I think the decision to leave such large gaps between the graves is coming to bite them in the ass. But perhaps there's enough space to bury additional people in between the existing graves, if it came to that. Now, I've heard people question whether or not they would even be able to perform burials here, given that the ground would most certainly be frozen. And I for one believe it's definitely possible. Many northern cemeteries have what we call a thawing device. Essentially, it's a big old oven you place over the space to cook the ground so that it becomes diggable. And I don't think it's far-fetched for them to have scavenged one from another cemetery. Beautiful place with great attention to detail. We've reached the end. All these cemeteries are great in their own way. I picked these 10 games because I love them all. Many of them are quite different in art style, vibe, and worldly beauty, but that's what makes them special. I just wanted to say that before I announced the winner, because this is more of a measure of overall realism and practicality, rather than just how cool or aesthetically pleasing the place is. And we actually have a tie, with each having a score of 50 out of a possible 60 points. The Last of Us Part 2 and Grand Theft Auto 5 came in with a win. Again, these two are both well-maintained, organized, and thought-out parks, with a great attention to detail and an amazing deal of natural beauty. They both show a lot of respect to their real-life sources, and I think both Rockstar and Naughty Dog knocked it out of the park. This was a lot of fun to explore, and if you enjoyed this, consider subscribing. As much as I do like the line of work I'm in, I'm kinda burnt out on burying the dead, and I would much rather make YouTube videos full time. So hitting that subscribe button is a great way to help me out. And maybe I'll make a part 2 if this video does well. There's a lot of games that have cemeteries after all. We only just scratched the surface here. Feel free to leave me a comment, and I'll answer as many of your questions as I can. Go visit your local cemetery, get some fresh air, take a walk, and give it a rating of your own. Until next time, stay safe, stay on this side of the grass, and I'll see you later.